Culture Interrupted, produced by Cognitive Rise Productions. What is culture? How we observe and celebrate, how we care makes us a people upholding traditions built from our morals and experiences and values that we all have in common. Culture is how we share in the experience of life. Culture is how we celebrate life. What is happening in the cannabis industry? What are the changes and effects being felt? With regulation upon us, it is imperative that innovators remain compelling in action towards the ultimate goal, which is moving into a realm of highest quality standards and guidelines focused on wellness, harmony, education. Culture Interrupted is honored to present Steve DeAngelo.
I am co-founder and Chairman Emeritus of Harborside. I am the President and co-founder of the Arcview Group. I am a co-founder of Steep Hill Laboratory, and I am a charter member and co-founder of the National Cannabis Industry Association. Culture is critically important because culture is the vehicle by which you really execute meaningful and lasting social change. My whole life has been about making social change. My happiest memory of cannabis is my very first memory of cannabis. Shortly after consuming cannabis for the first time, I walked through a park. I was 13 years old. It was just a thoroughfare to me. I had never really noticed what was going on in this park before, but on this day, I started noticing things like the warmth of the sun on the back of my neck and the way the same sun was passing through the leaves of the trees, the way that those leaves, once dried and fallen, were crunching under my feet, and the aroma of those crushed leaves coming through my nose, and the sprinkling of sweat starting to pop out on the back of my neck from the sun coming down there at the same time that I'm hearing the gurgling of a creek in the background. All of these things came together for me in a moment of transcendence. I really felt myself to be part of the web of life in a way that I never had before, 13 years old. So at that time, all I knew was that it was heavy and that it was positive. Looking backwards, I recognize it really as my first genuine spiritual experience. The cannabis plant itself fosters community, and you can see it in the way that we circle up and we pass a joint. When that joint is going around and a new person walks up to the edge of the circle, we don't all huddle in and close our shoulders and make sure they don't get in. We all step out and we make a space and we welcome whoever it is that needs a little bit of that medicine. And it's one of the really beautiful things about cannabis culture. So the plant itself teaches us to love our neighbors, to welcome people who are different from us, to appreciate the things that make each of us unique. The legacy cannabis culture that has grown up around this plant has a really important role to play today because so many people who have never experienced cannabis before are being introduced to it for the first time, and they need an explanation. They need a roadmap. You know, you can give somebody a pencil and a piece of paper, but if you've never taught them the art of writing, those tools aren't going to be very useful. Cannabis isn't quite the same way because the plant itself is so powerful, but I think that people who have spent time, years, decades, coming to understand the plant, spending time under the influence of the plant, learn things about it that you just need to spend time to learn. And that's what we call this legacy cannabis culture. So it has a really important role to play now. So today, authentic legacy cannabis culture, the kind of culture that's been built by people who fell in love with this plant decades ago and have spent their lifetimes dedicated to understanding it, has a really important role to play now, especially because millions and millions of people around the world who've never experienced cannabis are being introduced to it. And many, many people, a lot of the cannabis industry, today's cannabis industry, is being developed and is being managed by people who are really interested in money, not because they have any kind of close connection to the plant. So you have a whole population of people who need to be educated about the plant, but the companies, for the most part, who are going to be providing the products to them, don't understand the plant themselves. So this is where legacy cannabis culture comes in, and understanding cannabis not through a prohibitionist lens, right? We have all grown up in a culture that looked at cannabis through a prohibitionist lens, and even those of us who love the plant have kind of absorbed this, right? So one example of this is the way that stoner culture embraces the idea of getting high, of getting wasted, right? And there's nothing wrong with joy and ecstasy. That's a normal and desirable part of the human experience. But understanding joy and ecstasy, not as being stoned, not as being wasted, right? But as being part of wellness, being part of a full and a complete life, not looking at cannabis as an intoxicant through this prohibitionist lens, but understanding it as a tool for better living through a holistic lens.
You are listening to Culture Interrupted.
You know, I believe that cannabis has the power to teach us some really valuable lessons if we open our hearts and we open our minds and we listen for them and we take them seriously. And these lessons have been incorporated into cannabis culture. And they're things like understanding the value of nature and how much joy and meaning it can bring to life. Right? Understanding the importance of tolerance, of welcoming differences and celebrating differences amongst human beings. Right? Being generous, being kind, right? Having fun, right? Loving one another, caring about what happens in the world, and being open to the new, embracing change. These are all things that cannabis teaches us, and I hope that these values, that these lessons are incorporated into cannabis culture moving forward, just as they have been moving in from the past. I think that cannabis is this amazing plant that grows all over the world, that has been used by every single human culture, almost every single human culture, for millennia upon millennia. It has seen an infinite, almost, number of cultural expressions. People have passed it to the left, they've passed it to the right. They've smoked it in solitude, and they've smoked it in crowds. They've smoked it, they've rubbed it on their screen, they've put it in oil, they've dropped it over their head, they've bathed in it, they've put it in tents and breathed it in, and you know what? All of those ways are beautiful and joyous. And this is another one of the beautiful things about cannabis, is that different groups of people, different cultures, can have their own rituals and their own ways. And I honor each and every one of those. I became an advocate for cannabis because I fell in love with the plant and decided there was no way that it would not be a part of my life. I wasn't going to give it up. And at the same time, the idea of spending my life hiding because of a law that never should have been passed in the first place was unacceptable to me. The idea of doing that made me angry. And so making cannabis legal was a prerequisite for my own personal happiness, and I made it my mission.
You are listening to Culture Interrupted.
Prop 64 reminds me of this book that was written about Michelangelo called The Agony and the Ecstasy, right? The agony and the ecstasy of Prop 64. I have really, really mixed feelings about it. This has been a period of time that has ripped my heart down the middle. You know, on the one hand, to finally see this plant legal, to see every adult in the state of California be able to walk into a dispensary and get clean, tested, legal cannabis and not have to worry about getting arrested, to know that cops no longer have this convenient excuse to go after people who are black or brown or people who look weird like me, there's times when I even forget that it's happened. It's like I'll be sitting somewhere, I'll be like getting ready to smoke a joint or roll a joint or something, and I'll be hunching my shoulders and I'll be looking around and I'll go, dude, it's legal, chill, right? And so that's beautiful. It's a wonderful, wonderful thing. What's really hard is that the regulations that have been put into place are making it almost impossible for most of the legacy cannabis companies to stay in existence in the state of California. It is an extinction event for many of the people who were most responsible, who made the sacrifices to bring us to the place that we are today. And that is a tragedy, right? It's a tragedy. My feelings around Prop 64 haven't changed at all. I was always a proponent of Prop 64. I am still a proponent of Prop 64 today, despite the agony, the tragedy that I see that it's caused, because it's also created a lot of really, really wonderful things have happened as a result of Prop 64. And I knew, really from the day that I started on this mission decades ago, that if we made cannabis legal, then the mainstream business community was going to get involved in it. That's the trade-off. But for me, my allegiance, the thing that I want to accomplish most, is to make sure that every single person on this planet that needs and can benefit from cannabis has it in a free, accessible, and legal way. Right? And I don't really care who gets rich off of it and who gets the lion's share of the wealth from it. Right? And if I can convince global corporations to take this plant and use their influence and get laws changed and move this thing all around the world, then to me, that's a wonderful benefit. That's a triumph. It's not a defeat. If you had asked me before January 1st, how much of my decision-making was influenced by a dollar figure calculation, I would tell you very little. Right? We were living in a different world then. It was a nonprofit world. It was a world that did not have a lot of very sophisticated business competitors or very well-financed business competitors. And in that environment, myself and Harborside were able to thrive and not have to look that closely at the dollar consequences of the decisions that we made. It's very different today. Harborside, like every other company in the California market, has to watch every single penny we spend. We have to think very carefully about every dollar because we're living in a hyper-competitive for-profit market today. And legacy cannabis companies that don't learn how to survive in this new environment are going to be eaten for lunch. Harborside holds licenses all across the supply chain. A few years ago, I recognized that when regulations came into play, that there would be a lot of disruption. I didn't know what those regulations would look like, so I didn't know what kind of disruption there would be. But I knew that if I occupied a position across the entire supply chain, from cultivation all the way through to retail, that no matter where the pressure came, I would be able to calibrate. So in this recent period where there's been this shortage of clean, pesticide-free cannabis for the legal market, our own farm, Harborside Farms, has been able to fill that gap, and we've had a very nice selection throughout this whole shortage period. The process of getting the licenses that we got, just the process of applying for them in a way that gave us confidence that they would be granted, was very time-consuming. It required a lot of outside legal help. It was expensive. It was a challenge in itself. But then the costs of complying with the regulations as they have been coming into effect have been huge. They've required many, many changes in the way that we operate and who we can do business with, what kind of products we can sell, how we can display those products, whether or not how we can promote those products. We used to give products away for free when we did promotions. We're not allowed to do that anymore. It's totally not allowed. We've had to adjust to the tax burden. There's this very high tax burden on the legal cannabis market right now. And that's forced us to really think about what kind of products we have, where we get them, what we pay for them, and make sure that we have affordable options for our now we used to call them patients, and now we call them clients.
You are listening to Culture Interrupted.
So most legacy cannabis companies are finding themselves short on some of the skill sets and the financial resources that they need to negotiate this new reality. Because in the world that we grew up in, we didn't have an opportunity to develop some of the skills that are really critical today. Finance. Well, in the world that we grew up in, the federal government was still raiding us and prosecuting us and locking us up. And if you kept financial records, that could be evidence to put you in prison. So we didn't become very adept with keeping financial records, right? Compliance. Well, there weren't any regulations for us to comply with. So we didn't have compliance departments, right? It was only until now that we had regulations. So there are skill sets that legacy cannabis companies have not had the opportunity to develop that are really important moving into the future. And neither have we had an opportunity to really interact with the investor class, because until very recently, most investors would turn around and run the other way if they saw somebody who was selling weed, not embrace them as an opportunity. Now that's changed. And what we see on the other hand now is new cannabis companies coming in. They have all of the skill sets they need to survive in the mainstream business place. They can raise lots of money, but what they miss is the legacy cannabis expertise, the understanding of the plant, the understanding of why people really consume cannabis and what the trends and what the preferences are, right? So this is why, the suits and the OGs, we're each half of what's needed to really optimize this plant and bring it to the world. We're not going to do it without the suits and the corporations, but if the legacy cannabis culture isn't incorporated into that process, the world's going to be way poorer for it. Several years ago, as the legal cannabis industry started forming, and the conferences that I was addressing started growing from dozens of people to hundreds of people to thousands of people. And I would look out from the podium and I would see mostly people who looked like me, my race, my age, my gender. And that was troubling. That was troubling to me. It was troubling to a few other people in the industry. And we began within the industry to call for a welcome embrace of people who were different. To build diversity into the industry. A, because it was the right thing to do, and B, because we know that diversity makes us stronger and we needed to be strong. That vibration within the industry has now been picked up by a lot of different states, a lot of different cities. Oakland was the first one to do it. We're now seeing the same thing being implemented in Los Angeles. Even on the East Coast in Massachusetts, they have an equity program. Now, the Massachusetts equity program is very interesting to me because I went to Massachusetts 5 years ago and was granted a provisional license by the Department of Public Health in Massachusetts, and found a lovely property in downtown Boston that would have made for a wonderful Harborside dispensary, and was never allowed to exercise that license and open that dispensary because I am a convicted cannabis felon. So because of my felony conviction, our company was not allowed to open that dispensary. Now, 5 years later, kind of a bittersweet thing for me, the Massachusetts licensing authorities are giving priority to people who have prior cannabis felony convictions. So I think that the equity programs, for us not to have equity programs as we grow this industry would be to pile injustice upon injustice. The original animating purpose of the cannabis laws in the United States were for purposes of racial control. Right? The disparity, the racial disparity in cannabis enforcement and cannabis arrest is not an accident. It is not an unintended consequence of the drug war, right? It was the animating purpose. It was the reason that laws were passed against cannabis in the very first place. So for us not to address that wrong, if people of color and people who have been arrested for these laws are not made a part of the industry, then we haven't done our job. We haven't succeeded yet until that happens.
You are listening to Culture Interrupted.
The market 5 years out. Well, what I think is going to happen is that the States Act is going to be passed in 1919 or 1920. The States Act is going to force the federal government to respect state cannabis laws, whether they're adult use laws or they are medical cannabis laws. I think the same time that happens, the federal government is going to reschedule cannabis from Schedule 1 to Schedule 2. The reason for that is that the pharmaceutical industry is going to demand that it happens because the potential upside in cannabis pharmaceuticals is so large that they would not want to be left out of the action. So we're going to see a divergence. We're going to see a big shift of medical cannabis into pharmaceutical companies, into general practitioners' offices, into being dispensed by pharmacies. I think that you're going to see a much, much larger, what I call wellness market for cannabis. Think about the difference between a prescription drug and going into the GNC and getting an herb or a supplement. I think that most of the cannabis market is going to look more like that because we really know that we can make beautiful whole plant medicines and cannabis preparations that are perfectly adequate for most people. We're going to see the development of a whole new range of product formats. So one of the things that's happening now is the development of rapid onset cannabis beverages. Beverages that give you an effect profile more like alcohol. You feel the effect more rapidly, the effect wears off more quickly. So cannabis beer, cannabis whiskey, all sorts of spirits, this kind of thing is already hitting the market. We've seen companies like Molson's and Constellation Brands jump into cannabis. That trend is going to continue and move forward. We're also going to see CBD become probably the most widely used nutritional supplement in the world, and it will be understood and related to that way. I think that one really good way of dealing with it would just be having municipalities add CBD to the water supply like they do fluoride now. So there's just going to be a vast range of human consumables that are going to hit the market in formats that we can't even imagine right now. Then we will see also a resurgence of industrial hemp as the stigma surrounding cannabis gets dialed down, as more and more investors feel comfortable putting financial resources behind the industry. We're going to see the full potential of industrial hemp realized. And what many people don't know is that anything that you make from petroleum or from cotton or from trees, you can make from hemp instead. And you can make it in an eco-friendly way. You can create more biomass in a year on 1 acre growing hemp than you can in multiple years growing trees. Right? So we're going to see hemp plastics. We're going to see them used in 3D printing. We're going to see automobiles rolling down the road made 50, 60, 70% of their components could be made out of cannabis. So there's a whole new world that's waiting in front of us. Really, cannabis can do what my friend Jack Herer always promised. It can save the world.
You are listening to Culture Interrupted.
So we don't really have to wonder anymore about what happens when we make cannabis legal. We made cannabis legal in Colorado and in Washington in 2012. Right? That was almost 7 years ago now. So there's a body of evidence, of statistical evidence that allows us to measure what happens to things like the black market for cannabis when you make it legal. Well, in Colorado, it's down by 50%, something in that neighborhood. And that means that a huge amount of resources, financial resources, and power has been removed from the criminal underground and returned to the above ground economy. A great thing. But what else has happened since cannabis has been made legal? In legal cannabis states, if you take a look across the board, alcohol use down, binge drinking down, suicide down, Medicaid reimbursements down, pharmaceutical use down, domestic violence down. In the state of Washington, rapes and thefts went down 30%, 10 to 30%, relative to the neighboring states that did not make that change. So what do we know now? We know that when you make cannabis legal, it has a whole range of positive effects that help not just the people who use cannabis, but everybody, our whole society. I believe that cannabis consumers deserve every range of choice that other consumers have available to them. I believe that they should be able to purchase absolutely stunningly amazing, handmade, curated, artisan quality luxury products. I believe that they should be able to buy super affordable budget economy products. I believe that they should be able to buy everything in between. I want to see a free market for cannabis. I think that cannabis consumers have a range of tastes, they have a range of budgets, and so they deserve the same choices every consumer does. I think that there's some really beautiful things about our culture, and one of the things that I hope remains is our cheerfulness. We're a very cheerful people, us people of the plant. There's not many circumstances in which we can't find a way to smile or laugh, even when we are in grief, even when we're in despair. This plant reminds us to find the light, to nurture the light, to bring it into our hearts, to turn it into joy, and to be cheerful. And there's this great story I've got. When I went to Eastern Europe to make jeans out of hemp, I hired a translator, Agnes Palotas, who was a Hungarian woman, very, very conservative, straight-laced woman, never consumed cannabis, never would think about consuming cannabis. And we toured around Europe selling these jeans in various different trade shows. And we went to the Cannabis Cup in Amsterdam, and we had a wonderful time selling jeans, hanging out. And then we went to a bunch of other shows, like the Jeans Show and the Cologne Business Center, right? And after this tour, Agnes and I were sitting down, we were talking about the tour, and she says, "Steve, I don't know whether it was the cannabis or something else, but everybody seems so much friendlier in Amsterdam," right? And it's of course it's the cannabis, right? Of course it's the cannabis. So may that spirit of cheerfulness and joy and generosity always animate us. It's one of the many things that make us so beautiful. What I would like to see dissolve in cannabis culture is the prohibitionist lens that many of us still look at our use through. I call it lingering stoner shame, right? Because we've grown up in this place where we saw all these sizzling egg commercials and Dare, and we were told all of these lies for so long, there's people who love cannabis, who know cannabis, who use it every day, who are still sometimes really tortured by their use. They have this conflict inside them. And I remember one example of this beautiful, beautiful guy. He was a devout Christian, a born-again Christian, right? Goes to church every single day of the week. And before he went to church, he liked to take one toke on a pipe of cannabis to open his heart and his spirit before he goes into church. But the church and the preacher were not groovy with cannabis, right? They were really down on cannabis. And so I was with him and he was really tortured and he didn't know what to do because he knew that the cannabis helped him, right? But he also felt guilty about using it. And I just laid a little bit of history on him and talked about how different schools of religion for thousands of years, right? From the Hindus to the Muslims to Hebrews to early Christians have used cannabis as a sacrament and that's one of its most ancient purposes. And once I laid that history on him and told him about it and he could look at it through this different kind of a lens, it was like this huge weight became lifted off of his shoulders, right? So I'd like to see that lingering stoner shame taken off of everybody's back.
You are listening to Culture Interrupted.
The legal cannabis industry is in its infancy, and it will follow a trajectory like many other industries, like all other growing industries do. And there's going to be a boom period. We're in that boom period right now, where more and more companies are being formed, new brands, new products, investors are excited, money is pouring in, it's the beginning. And everybody's future is super, super bright. If you look at anybody's business plan now, it has curves that go straight up like that, right? But after a while, the rubber starts to hit the road, right? And some companies do better, some products get traction in the marketplace, some don't, and you start seeing a sort of a separating out, right? You'll see companies that are going to succeed, you'll see companies that are not so successful. And as that trend goes on, you're going to see a consolidation. The number of companies that we have, the number of products that are being made, this profusion of new things that are happening is going to begin to stabilize. Consumers will start choosing their favorites. Those favorites will start growing. Things that aren't chosen as favorites are going to start disappearing from the marketplace. This is all going to happen over a period of years. But it's the trajectory that you see in every other new growing business, and you'll see it with cannabis as well. My business, like any legacy cannabis business that wants to survive, has been in a process of change for the past year. Our decisions used to be ruled mostly by our hearts, by our emotions, by our connection to the plant, by the values that the plant taught us. And we were living in this kind of gray market, unregulated, semi-legal, but not totally legal kind of environment where we were able to do that. We had a lot of freedom to be able to do that. That freedom has largely been taken away with us with the transition to a completely legal marketplace and the entry of investors and very sophisticated executive teams who have not hundreds of thousands of dollars, not millions of dollars, right? But tens of millions of dollars behind them in order to establish new businesses. I've had to adjust to that new reality, and now a lot of our decisions are driven by the need to compete, the need to survive. And we are working to keep as much of that traditional cannabis culture, the values that the plant has taught us, in our business as we possibly can. But the way that we express those values is changing. I'll give you an example. Over the last 12 years, we spent $5.5 million providing completely 100% free holistic healing services to anybody who walked into Harborside. We didn't even ask them how much money they made or whether they could afford to pay for it or not. Well, now we do. We have a sliding scale arrangement where folks who can afford to pay for those services are going to be asked to pay for those services. Folks who can't afford to pay the full freight will get a greatly reduced rate, so that we try and keep the spirit of generosity, of helping each other, intact, but we do it in a way so that we can survive, that we can continue to be present in a competitive environment. We've talked about this transition, right? and some of the pain that's attached to it. And I want to talk a little bit about those sacrifices because I think it's really, really important that people who are new to cannabis understand that people paid some of the most heavy prices that human beings can pay to bring us to this point. Cannabis was almost wiped out in the United States in the early 1980s by Ronald Reagan and the whole Just Say No thing, and a bunch of really hardy and brave people up in the Emerald Triangle, despite helicopters flying over their houses all the time, kept on planting those seeds and kept on nurturing that plant and kept on protecting her from people who would harm her, who would eradicate her completely from this planet. And they paid a heavy price. People were arrested. People had their homes seized. They were put on trial. They were ostracized. Their children were taken away from them. People were put in prison. People were killed. People died in this war. Lives were ruined. Whole families' lives were ruined. And that should never be forgotten. Should never be forgotten. And now this group of people is being called upon really to make like the ultimate sacrifice now. When you sacrifice like that, it's natural. It's a human natural emotion to come to feel that that thing is yours, that it belongs to you, that you have paid the price in suffering so that this thing is yours. And there's a huge temptation to do that, right? But it wouldn't be right, okay? It wouldn't be right. We weren't given this plan. It didn't come into our hands so that we could be wealthy. It came into our hands so that we could change the world. And so now what we need to do is allow her to claim her full destiny, to go out into the world, to go into every single hand of every single person, of every single company, of everywhere, everywhere, everywhere. And that means that this beautiful, groovy, very cheerful world that we had for many, many years it's changing, and a lot of it's going to disappear. But maybe, just maybe, if we get enough of this plant into the hands of enough people, quickly enough, we can avert human beings from killing each other and cooking this planet through nuclear war or climate destruction or religious or racial intolerance or any one of the other things that's threatening to blow the whole thing up, right? And if we don't do it with cannabis, I don't know how we do it.
We appreciate you making the time to listen to Culture Interrupted.